In the winter of 1944, a 31-year-old man stood on a railroad platform in the early dark, holding a draft notice the government had promised 2 years earlier he would never receive. He had a wife, he had a son barely old enough to remember his face, and he had until a few months before a piece of paper called a 3A classification, the deferment that was supposed to mean fathers stayed home. It did not mean that anymore, and his story, a story like thousands of others, began with a promise the country had already broken, a promise rooted in decisions made years before he ever received his notice. To understand how a husband and father, with every legal protection a 1940s family man could hold, ended up boarding a troop train in the war's final, bloodiest stretch, you have to go back to the months right after Pearl Harbor. In 1940, when the draft began, men with dependent children were placed low on the list. The thinking was simple. A nation does not casually break up families to fight a war. Local boards classified these men 3A, deferred because of dependency, and for the first 2 years of American involvement, that classification largely held. For those first 2 years, fatherhood was treated almost like a shield. A man could register, sit through his physical, hear his number called, and still go home because the country had decided, as a matter of policy, that breaking up a household wasn't worth the manpower it freed up. Husbands built their lives around that assumption. They bought houses on the strength of it. They had second children on the strength of it. The government's own paperwork told them, in black and white, that this was how it would stay. But total war does not respect classifications. By the spring of 1943, the United States was feeding men into 2 oceans of combat at once, and the pool of single, childless men of military age was running dry. Selective Service Director Louis B. Hershey told local boards that dependency deferments could be set aside if replacements weren't available. Suddenly, fathers were back on the table, and the men who had organized their entire lives around a government promise discovered, almost overnight, that the promise had quietly stopped applying. What happened next played out in the United States Senate. On October 1st, 1943, lawmakers took up a bill, S-763, meant to protect roughly 6 million men who had become fathers before December 7, 1941. One senator after another rose to argue that this was a matter of honor as much as policy. These were men who had built families under a government guarantee, married, and had children based on what the country had told them, and now that guarantee was being quietly withdrawn, while the country looked the other way. The phrase used again and again on the Senate floor was that pre-Pearl Harbor fathers had a special claim, that whatever the manpower crisis demanded, it shouldn't fall first on men who had done everything right by the rules as they existed when they made their choices. For a few weeks, the fathers won. The bill moved, the political pressure held, and newspapers reported that the father draft had been slowed. Then, that same October, Selective Service eliminated the 3A classification outright. The exemption that had shielded pre-Pearl Harbor fathers vanished, and in some draft boards, men who had already received notices found their cases reopened within days, sometimes reversed twice in a matter of weeks, depending on which version of the rule was in effect when the paperwork crossed a clerk's desk. One father might receive his notice, see it canceled under the restored protection, and then receive it again a few weeks later, when the protection itself was narrowed. For families living through it, the back and forth wasn't an abstraction. It was weeks of not knowing whether to plan for a husband staying or a husband leaving. This is the most our father stepped into. He was exactly the kind of man the 1940 draft had been built to protect. Married before the war, a child born more than a year before Pearl Harbor, a steady job. For 2 years, none of that mattered less than it should have. Then, almost overnight, all of it stopped mattering at all. He was not a... By 1945, nearly 1 million American fathers had been pulled into uniform. Men whose induction notices arrived not in the patriotic rush of December 1941, but in the grinding manpower crisis of the war's last 2 years, when the fighting in Europe and the Pacific was consuming replacements faster than the country could train them. To fill the gap that even drafting fathers couldn't close, Selective Service also reached down to 18-year-olds in growing numbers, meaning the Army our composite father joined in 1944 was, in a strange way, 2 armies at once, teenagers fresh out of high school, and husbands and fathers a decade or more older than most of the men training beside them. Picture the morning he left. Not a parade, not a band. A gray platform, a small bag, a wife trying to keep her voice steady, and a boy too young to understand why his father was getting on a train. Men like him reported to induction centers across the country that winter: Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, carrying the same quiet arithmetic in their heads: a mortgage, a job held open or not held at all, a child who would be a year older, sometimes two by the time they saw him again. Basic training took the soft edges off quickly. A man in his 30s, used to a workbench or a desk, found himself running obstacle courses alongside 18-year-olds, straight out of high school, doing calisthenics at dawn, and route marches with a full pack in the afternoon heat. The Army didn't make exceptions for age or family status once the uniform was on. The same 14-week cycle of drill, marksmanship, and field tactics applied whether a man had left behind a high school sweetheart or a wife and a 2-year-old. What it did offer, and what became the lifeline for men like him, was the mail. By 1944, the volume of mail crossing the oceans to American servicemen had become almost impossible to comprehend. In the 1943 fiscal year, the Army had handled roughly 570 million pieces of mail. By 1945, that number had climbed past 2.5 billion. The Navy's mail nearly doubled in the same span, and across all branches the total for 1945 alone approached 3 billion pieces. Ships and planes that needed every spare pound for ammunition and fuel were instead hauling sacks of letters. Because the Army and the Postal Service both understood something simple: a soldier who heard from home fought better and came home more whole than one who didn't. Mail call became, by every soldier's account, second in importance only to food. The solution was V-mail, victory mail. A soldier or a wife wrote on a single specially printed sheet, no larger than a postcard's worth of space. That sheet was photographed onto microfilm. The film was flown or shipped across the ocean, and at the other end it was printed back out, postcard-sized, and delivered. One reel of film the size of a spool of thread could carry thousands of letters that would otherwise have filled dozens of mailbags. Space that went, instead, to bullets, rations, and spare parts. Between June 1942 and the war's end, more than 1 billion V-mail letters moved through that system, free for the soldier to send, a few cents for the family back home. For our father, V-mail became the thread connecting a barracks in England, or later a frozen position in the Vosges Mountains, to a kitchen table back home. He would have written the way most fathers in his position wrote, not about what he'd seen because military censors would have cut it anyway, but about the small things: asking how the boy was sleeping, whether the truck still ran, telling his wife not to worry. In the flat, careful tone men used when they meant the opposite. Soldiers writing under those constraints often filled their pages with what one historian called trivial little things: the weather, a joke, a question about a neighbor, because anything that mattered most couldn't be written down at all. And his wife wrote back the same way: the weather, the neighbors. A drawing the boy had made, folded small enough to fit the V-mail form. For both of them, the gap between letters could stretch for weeks. Censorship rules often kept soldiers from even confirming where they were, so a wife might not learn her husband had survived a campaign until long after it ended, and only because a magazine or a newsreel let her piece it together herself. Neither of them could say what they were really thinking: that every week without a letter was a week of not knowing, and that for some families, the silence never ended. That's the part of this story that has to be said plainly, because it's the part the numbers carry. By the time the war ended, roughly 180,000 American children had lost their fathers. Not uncles, not neighbors, fathers, men who had gone in many cases exactly the way ours did, not eager volunteers from December 1941, but husbands called up 2 and 3 years later, when the country had already used up the men who had no one waiting for them. For those families, the V-mail letters that had once been a lifeline became something else entirely: the last things their fathers ever wrote to them, kept in a drawer or a shoebox for the rest of a mother's life, and eventually a child's. For the families where the father came home, the cost didn't disappear. It just changed shape. A man could be present in a house and still be somewhere else entirely, carrying things he never described, not even in the V-mail letters that had been their whole connection for a year or two. Children who had been infants or toddlers, when their fathers left, came home from school to a stranger who knew their names from letters, but had to learn their faces all over again. Wives who had run a household alone for 2 years, paying bills, raising children, sometimes working in a factory or an office for the first time, found themselves renegotiating, almost overnight, who made decisions and how. None of this was written about much at the time. It simply happened, in millions of houses, in the months after VJ Day. This is where the dramatized account at the center of this video lives, not as a documented record of one specific man, but as a composite drawn honestly from exactly the pattern the historical record shows. The pre-Pearl Harbor father, deferred by promise, drafted by necessity, connected to his family by a postcard-sized photograph of a letter, and changed by the time he came home, in ways no one in 1944 had a word for. There was no medal for this, no headline. The sacrifice asked of these men wasn't a single dramatic stand under fire. Though plenty of them saw combat, and some never came back from it, it was something quieter and in its way harder to carry. A man who had been told, in writing, that his family came first, learning that the war didn't honor that promise, and going anyway, because that's what the moment required, and because somewhere on a different continent, men just as tired and just as far from home were doing the same thing for families of their own. When the trains brought these fathers home, late in 1945 into 1946, the country was already moving on, eager to forget the years of rationing, blackouts, and casualty lists posted in store windows. But in millions of households, something had to be relearned. How to be a family again, with a man who had left as a civilian and come back as someone his own children sometimes didn't recognize at first glance, and who didn't always recognize, in the mirror, the man he'd been before the draft notice arrived. There was no GI Bill chapter written specifically for this. No campaign ribbon that said drafted late, with children, against an earlier promise. The men who fell into this group simply folded back into civilian life, back to the workbench, the desk, the same neighborhood, carrying 2 extra years that nobody else in the family had lived through, and that they themselves often chose never to discuss. For the children who grew up in those households, the war years became a gap. A father who appeared in family photographs before 1954 vanished for a stretch marked only by a shoebox of small, printed letters, and then reappeared, older, quieter, in 1945 or 1946, expected to simply pick up where he'd left off. The history books remember the landings, the battles, the names of generals. They remember less often the platform in the gray morning, the V-mail letters folded into a shoebox, and the nearly 1 million fathers who left families they had been promised they'd never have to leave, and who carried that quiet, unphotographed sacrifice home with them, where it stayed, mostly unspoken, for the rest of their lives. It asked nothing in return. It got, for the most part, nothing in return. And it remains one of the most ordinary and one of the most overlooked costs of the entire war.